I'm sure most fans, or even those casually acquainted with Hong Kong's Category 3 films, will be familiar with the 1980 exploitation shocker Lost Souls, but hopefully this video can help you gain a better appreciation for it. Although I find the comparison a bit reductive, because of the inhumane torture and humiliation scenes, the film is often referred to as Hong Kong's answer to Pasolini's Salo, which should, by default, make it an appropriate candidate for Hong Kong's most disturbing film. Yet, despite the film being problematically exploitative, it highlights a part of Hong Kong's history that's massively overlooked. The film's set in 1980, and is about a group of people trying to flee from the impoverished areas of mainland China to reach the then British Hong Kong in order to become rich. They fantasise about reaching a place called Diamond Hill specifically, which is an area in the east of Kowloon that they think is full of diamonds and will provide them with a better life. But to achieve this, these mainland immigrants must overcome the British Hong Kong government's controversial touch-based policy, which results in them falling prey to a group of sadistic bandits who brutally torture and sexually abuse them. Active from 1974 to 1980, the touch-based policy was an immigration system that functioned like a game, a very, very brutal game. If illegal immigrants from China were able to cross the border or swim through shark-infested waters to get to Hong Kong, they had to race to the urban areas to touch base. This often meant suffering the dense and treacherous rural New Territories, which makes up around 86.2% of Hong Kong's land. Successful immigrants could then claim for permanent residency. However, if they were caught by the police before reaching touch base, they would be sent back to the border. From when they enter Hong Kong until they reach the touch base, they're essentially non-existent. If something happens to them along the way, not much can really be done about it, as they're unregistered, and want to keep away from the police for fears of being deported. So yeah, they're essentially lost souls. The film takes this potential vulnerability to the extreme, being one of Shaw Brothers' most shocking films, which was a direction the company adopted around this time. As most of you might know, Shaw Brothers was Hong Kong's biggest film studio, and by the end of the 1960s, forged a monopoly after its biggest competitor, MP&GI, or Cathay, lost its hold in the market following the passing of the company's founder in 1965. Many believe Shaw Brothers reached its peak in the 1970s with their distinctive martial arts classics, but by the 1980s, things changed, and the company only lasted until 1986. There are many reasons for this, but some of the major ones being the old school kung fu films that Shaw Brothers were famous for started losing popularity. The 1980s saw a major shift in Hong Kong filmmaking, particularly regarding the core New Wave filmmakers, whose approach to cinema almost completely contrasted with Shaw Brothers' kung fu classics. The key New Wave films were socially conscious, dealing with issues set and relevant to contemporary Hong Kong, and attempted more experimental styles and applications. Shaw was known mostly, though not solely, for the exact opposite. Socially ambiguous studio productions that were set in a very abstract version of a historical China. Another factor to consider was the establishment of Cinema City in 1979, who went on to dominate the local box office in the 1980s with their monumental action comedies set in modern Hong Kong. Not to mention the company's cooperation deal with Golden Princess Films that provided both businesses with distribution advantages that further challenged Shaw's dominance. With ticket prices becoming more expensive, cinema screens increasing, and TV keeping audiences out of the cinema, Shaw was in panic mode and attempted everything it could do to survive the harsh capitalist market that it once dominated. All Shaw could do at this point was provide audiences with something they couldn't get at home from their TV sets. So, the once glamorous and dignified company, on the surface at least, began producing an array of violent, gory, and borderline pornographic horrors and action films. Lost Souls is a quintessential example of the company's new direction, and was directed by the very interesting Mou Tun-Fei. Born in mainland China, his family moved to Taiwan in 1949 after the end of the Civil War, when the Communists beat the nationalist KMT. From an ideological perspective, the films he worked on were pretty damn diverse. From him working as an assistant director on the anti-communist propaganda film Give Me Back My Country in the late 60s, to then getting his own films banned by the Taiwanese government. In the late 1970s, he moved to Hong Kong to work for Shaw Brothers, doing a complete political 180 turn in 1988 when he collaborated with mainland China to make Men Behind the Sun, a horror about the atrocities committed by the Japanese army on Chinese civilians during World War II, a subject he would revisit in 1995 with The Black Sun, the Nanking Massacre. He has a tendency to tackle incredibly important political and historical topics using exploitation approaches, consisting of sadistic violence and softcore porn, something that he has been condemned for, as critics felt it trivialised and disrespected these sensitive moments in history. But on the other hand, this approach suited Shaw Brothers perfectly at the time. Although Mao contributed provocative and quite experimental works that paralleled the Hong Kong New Wavers, he was never properly considered to be part of it. This was likely due to the New Wave's association with mostly independent filmmaking, and Mao was employed by the epitome of commercialism itself, Shaw Brothers. Don't get me wrong, there were filmmakers connected to the New Wave like Clifford Choi, who directed a couple of films for Shaw Brothers as well, but his early contribution to the culturally important 1980s youth films and his detailed depiction of Hong Kong's localisation made his works more relevant to the movement, especially when the likes of Pak Tong-chuk argue that the New Wave filmmakers were essentially those who completed Hong Kong cinema's localisation process, which for him began in the 1960s. In addition to this, Mao became known for producing horror and softcore pornographic films, which was seen as a lower brow standard of filmmaking, not worthy of the more culturally and artistically sophisticated New Wave cinema. Even New Wave directors like Alex Chung, who was also known for fast-paced genre films, was subtle enough with his satirical elements to qualify. I just think Mao was too exploitative with his subject matters and heavy-handed with his socio-political messaging to make it as either a core or non-core New Wave filmmaker. But as Chang Min-yu puts it, although he was not recognised by most critics as being part of the New Wave, he was undeniably part of the broader trend. Lost Soul's socio-political commentary and didacticism is certainly on the nose, but I have a feeling audiences outside of Hong Kong might not be aware of the historical details behind it, and some recent research on the touch-based policy has retrospectively made the film's message especially important. The original policy came from an oral agreement between the British colonial government and the Guangdong provincial authorities as a means for the colonial government to re-establish its immigration control regime against Chinese immigration. But the policy also provides an insight into how the government tried to shape public discourse on Chinese immigrants and capitalised on existing discriminatory attitudes in Hong Kong society to help fuel exclusionism. But first, it's important to understand that immigration was a complicated issue for the British Hong Kong government, as they wanted to restrict Chinese immigrants, but at the same time needed them for their labour. Although the policy was not successful in fulfilling the colonial government's goal to re-establish full control of immigration, its discretionary nature provided a degree of flexibility which served Hong Kong's interests. As Tong Yong-yong puts it, the touch-based policy appeared to be a screening machine in itself too, resonating with social Darwinism. If one survived the hours of hiking, swimming through shark-infested waters, and evaded the radar of both the Chinese militiamen and the Hong Kong border guards, one could start a new life in Hong Kong. Illegal immigrants were a productive force. On the other hand, the colonial government recognised its own limitations and knew their resources could not properly facilitate the system to work on its own. So they needed the Hong Kong community to reject mainland immigrants and turn them in if caught. Sympathy between Hong Kongers and mainland immigrants was the touch-based policy's greatest threat. From the 1960s and up, Hong Kongers began to develop a local consciousness, where they started to negotiate an identity that separated them from both China and Taiwan. This incited many Hong Kongers, especially those outside of the working class, to envision themselves as somewhat superior to mainlanders. Anthropologist Hugh Baker even wrote an article about it in 1985, where he described the Hong Kong man, who is go-getting, highly competitive, tough for survival, quick thinking and flexible. A total contrast to the stereotypes of the mainland Chinese. This was symbolised in the 1979 TV series The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, where a character is called A Chan, a mainland Chinese who was rude, ignorant and uncivilised, compared to the more educated, intelligent and modern Hong Konger. In fact, the term A Chan, the pronunciation to which I'm butchering by the way, became a common way to refer to the mainland Chinese in Hong Kong. To help support the colonial government's complex interests, a campaign of anti-mainland Chinese would commence in order to solicit public support in this Darwinian treatment of immigrants, a task that should in theory have been made easier due to Hong Kong society developing this local consciousness. The pressure of the increasing population, changing demographic composition and socio-economic development eventually caused many members of Hong Kong society to turn their backs on Chinese immigrants, despite many of them coming from immigrants from China themselves. Hong Kong's colonial governor of the time, who ironically was actually famous for his more progressive approach, produced statements that stereotyped Chinese immigrants as being a social burden, undesirable, and prevented building a better Hong Kong. The government also associated young immigrants from China with criminals, claiming that many crimes, especially violent ones, were caused by mainlanders. The press also contributed to this troublemaker image of new immigrants, especially the anti-communist outlets. One even straight up accused the ex-Red Guards of threatening social stability and claimed they acquired a comfortable life at the cost of social order. Nevertheless, the claims the government made about mainlanders in order to capitalise on these growing sentiments were problematic, to say the least. The actual threat posed by immigrants was nowhere near as sinister as the government made out. Members of the Executive Council were informed that the immigrants from China were mostly young, healthy and resourceful people. I mean, how else were they able to beat the touch base challenge? A frontline police officer specialising in illegal immigrants even described them as being hard-working, thrifty and able to stand on their own feet in a comparatively short time. In fact, most of the claims made by the government and media were massively exaggerated. Regarding immigrants sapping up resources and compromising economic development, this wasn't exactly true. A legislator even proposed that immigration laws be relaxed to alleviate the labour shortages in the textiles and clothing industries. Immigrants sabotaging Hong Kong's 10-year housing programme was another concern punctuated by the government, as they could potentially lengthen queues. But in 1981, the year of the programme's completion date, only half the target was met, an issue caused by an economic recession on the back of the oil crisis. Ironically, it would be the vast amounts of immigrants and their labour that would have contributed to combating this recession and stabilising the economy, thus making social welfare investments more feasible. One of the other concerns that the government used was Chinese immigrants would take away jobs from locals, but in reality, the opposite was true. Unemployment rates were at their lowest when illegal immigration was high. But what about mainland immigrants being a threat to Hong Kong's law and safety? Well, despite the fear-mongering, this was impossible to quantify. Even the governor admitted this. According to Roy Henry, the former police commissioner, although some illegal immigrants had to resort to crime for survival, which was mostly petty or quick cash crimes, there was no concrete evidence to prove that immigrants were primarily responsible for rising crime rates. Ironically, what did increase crime was significant numbers of police being sent to the borders in order to prevent illegal immigration, which caused people in urban areas to try their luck at crime due to the lack of police presence, which for me is amazing. So, this whole fear campaign against mainlanders was obviously exaggerated in order to turn Hong Kongers against them and aid in preventing immigrants from reaching the touch base. But anyway, back to the actual film. When the last person standing, TONG, finally arrives at Diamond Hill, he discovers that there are, in fact, no diamonds. And to add salt to this wound, it's predominantly a squatter area, where the slum living conditions were hardly better than those from where he came. These themes of illegal immigrants from mainland China having their dreams of Hong Kong destroyed by the territory's own harsh realities and experiencing hostility from the Hong Kong people were quite common in films during the time. In fact, another Shaw Brothers production, released 3 years later, the classic Hong Kong, Hong Kong, dealt with similar issues, albeit in a less exploitative way. Which isn't hard really, let's be honest. There are even some similarities with Tang Shu-Xuan's masterpiece, China Behind, which also depicted mainland Chinese people risking their lives to escape the horrid conditions, only to discover that capitalist Hong Kong came with its own soul-crushing implications. As exploitative and on the nose as the film is, it was drawing attention to what was a cruel policy that has been criminally overlooked from both Hong Kong and mainland China's history. Mainland illegal immigrants were as close to physical lost souls as you could get, neglected and exploited by both sides. However, although the film is pointing out, in the most heavy-handed way possible, the cruelty of the touch-based policy, it's not really what's being challenged here. The opening narration briefly describes the desperate conditions refugees from the mainland were going through, and at one point specifically asks Hong Kong people, do we really understand how tough it is for them? This is clearly an appeal to the Hong Kong people, to be more empathetic towards mainland Chinese immigrants, who were not only developing an unsympathetic attitude towards them, but such hostilities were being capitalised on by the colonial government in order to serve its own political means. A message that, despite growing hostilities towards mainlanders, was not truly absent from the sensibilities of the Hong Kong people. At the end of the day, a lot of these immigrants had families in Hong Kong, and despite harsh fines for harbouring illegal immigrants, few people are going to turn in their family. This is something reflected beautifully in a segment from the Far Eastern Economic Review, where it wrote, "At the street level, the Hong Kong Chinese, who are resigned to noise, dirt, frame conditions, and a great lack of social services, merely shrug and say to mainland relatives, forewarned of living conditions in Hong Kong, there's always room for one more." So, despite these growing tensions against mainlanders, Hong Kongers never lost their sense of empathy, even when it was being amplified by the local government and media, which was ultimately one of the reasons why the touch-based policy wasn't able to continue. You could say it was the empathy of the Hong Kong people that prevented this incredibly cruel policy from going on. I realise this video was quite historically dense, but I really think it's needed to truly appreciate the subject matter here. But as always, thanks for watching.